Welcome to our weekly Zoom news conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, we are focusing on one of the most lethal but underreported side effects of the pandemic, the threat of famine, which now is on the horizon for millions of people from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Central, and Latin America, according to the United Nations World Food Program. When we first read reports about the threat of famine, my immediate thought was of the central role ethnic media play in mobilizing relief from diaspora populations when earthquakes, hurricanes, and tsunamis hit. I remember the tsunami led to 20% of all relief sent by the United States for victims came from Asian Americans inspired by ethnic media outlets. I know this because we did a multilingual poll that documented it. Today's topic is almost like an early warning signal for us about the possibilities of what could happen as hunger spreads, food disruption, called food insecurity, in the wake of the economic devastation of the pandemic. Our speakers will address what's being done to avert the disaster. I'm turning the conference now over to today's moderator, Sunita Sarabji.
Welcome to the call. And I think in the interest of time, let's get right to it. First off is Steve Tarabella. He is the senior spokesperson at the UN World Food Program. Mr. Tarabella, welcome to the call.
So I'd like to give folks a snapshot of what's happening to address global hunger in hopes you find it newsworthy, either now or in the future in your reporting. But first, let me tell you who we are at the World Food Program and what we do so you can understand our work and why we're here with you today. So in a nutshell, the World Food Program is the hunger relief arm of the United Nations. We feed about 100 million people every year in about 88 countries in every region of the world. Since most of you tuning in, I understand, are based in the US, I should say that we don't deliver food in the US. We don't operate food banks, for instance. As a UN agency, we go in only where we're invited, which mostly means the developing world. Similarly, we're based in Rome, but we don't feed Italians. We have about 19,000 people on staff, about 90% of whom work in developing countries, since we work where the world's poorest and most vulnerable people live. And we do it with one of the largest budgets in the UN system, about $8.5 billion with a B, entirely funded by voluntary contributions. For the purposes of this briefing, to keep it in a tight window here, I'm going to focus just on 3 activities to give you a sense of what's happening in hunger relief right now and what WFP's role is. We respond first to natural disasters. So things like the 2010 earthquake that rocked Haiti, the typhoon that Sandy mentioned, that devastated the Philippines, Cyclone Idai that destroyed parts of Mozambique in 2019. Second, conflict. What you all see happening in places like Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and the connecting tissue between those two things, natural disasters and conflict, is really disruption to normal food distribution channels. So when things like, roads are bombed, and food can't reach people who need food, the UN steps in. The third activity that I would flag is the large umbrella of ongoing development aid, not in an emergency context like those two. Things such as school meals. We provide meals in the classroom to students in about 50 countries, very often the only meal they get any day. We help pregnant women and new mothers understand nutrition. We help communities become more resilient to climate shocks so that they can weather future disasters with less suffering. We help small farmers find markets for their produce. So there's a lot more than the emergency response. And I thought I'd throw that out there to give you a fuller picture. what we actually provide. We don't provide nice, tidy food baskets of the sort you might see in the parking lots of churches and US food banks right now in the States. We provide, and we don't provide in most cases hot meals. We provide the very basics to help people sustain themselves, either until long-term solutions can be developed. Mostly because the communities we work in may not have cooking facilities or electricity or refrigeration. So we provide things like flour, rice, lentils, split peas, cooking oil, salt. And to accomplish that, we have about 5,000 trucks, 20 cargo ships, and about 100 planes somewhere on the move every day, somewhere in the world. So why am I telling you all this in hopes that you'll find our work newsworthy? It's because for some years, we and others working on global hunger, including many national governments, were really effective in chipping away at hunger rates. And we were bringing hunger down to what we hoped would be the zero hunger goal of the UN, meaning no hunger by the year 2030. It's pretty clear now that's not going to happen. Over the past few years, each year, we've seen hunger rising. So a significant and very disappointing change in that trend. Right now, there are about 690 million people hungry in the world. So what's changed to make that trend go in the wrong direction? It's what I call the 3 C's: conflict, climate, and COVID. So conflict, I think it's fair to say that the largest hunger crises right now in the world are the direct result of man-made conflict, things that are entirely preventable. What we see in Yemen, South Sudan, Myanmar, Syria, and other places. Fighting makes it often impossible for people to access food. When roads are bombed, trucks carrying flour and lentils can't get through, right? When airstrips are destroyed, planes carrying cooking oil can't land. And when fighting continues day and night, hungry people can't venture out safely to seek food, nor can aid workers venture out safely to provide food. Basically, when people are fighting, they're not farming. So violence and conflict is the single biggest driver of hunger right now, and which is why Sandy mentioned the threat of famine several times in her introduction. Violence is threatening food security in other ways, like terrorist acts against villagers and aid workers. Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS, and maybe some of you saw the news early this week about a WFP staff member killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo, along with the Italian ambassador to the DRC while they were visiting a school feeding site. These are not academic risks. These are very real risks. So in addition to conflict, I would say the second C is climate crises. This is something that looks different in different places. So maybe in Zimbabwe, it's drought, and in Sudan, it's rains and flooding, but the challenge is the same. It's communities that are devastated and lack the resources to recover without international help. Now, on top of conflict and climate crises, we have COVID. COVID is making the poorest of the world poorer and the hungriest of the world hungrier. Before COVID, we estimated there were about 135 million people acutely hungry in the world, meaning people who literally don't know where their next meal is coming from. And we estimate now that that has almost doubled to about 270 million because of COVID. Not entirely because of the health impact of the disease, the epidemic, but the economic impact, things like significant drops in remittances, which make it very hard for people to procure food. So I said at the start that we feed about 100 million people a year because of COVID and continued conflict. Last year, that rose to 114 million people. That's the greatest caseload WFP has had in any year in our 60-year history. And this year, we expect it might rise to about 120 million. That's pretty astonishing. So these three things, conflict, climate, and COVID, have pushed the world closer to famine in a number of countries, especially in parts of 4 countries, Yemen, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso.
Thank
Over.
you, Steve. Yes, our first question is from Oni Advincula. Oni?
Thank you, Sunita. I'm just going to read my question. In many poor countries like the Philippines, where I was originally from, COVID, conflict, and climate change, they just exacerbate food insecurity and hunger. The main problem, the mainstay culprit, is corruption in the government. How does your development work address this issue? And as a journalist for an ethnic media outlet, how do you see my role in my reporting to find solution to this very complicated problem?
Boy, you guys aren't even going to give me an easy one. First off, we're going right to corruption. No, that's a really interesting question. And that's a question, Oni, that I suspect people in many countries could ask. The reality is WFP, like all UN agencies, operates in country at the pleasure of the national government. So we have to work very closely with the government in determining what provinces or what regions to work in to provide this kind of assistance here, but maybe this kind of assistance here. It has to be collaborative or it won't work. Obviously, where there is some sense of inappropriate activity or decision-making by a government, we do our best to help the people in positions of authority see what's really needed in terms of feeding their people. But we can do only what we can do within the confines of our mandate, which is to feed people regardless of what tribe they're affiliated with or what political party or what leaders they support. I'm afraid it's one of those long-standing ongoing issues that a food agency isn't going to be able to solve. We just do the best we can to work within whatever we encounter.
How cooperative are local governments with WFP? And have you encountered instances where governments are not cooperative?
Yes. Look, the reality is there are some national governments that would prefer not to talk about hunger, not to acknowledge that they are unable to feed their people. They would prefer maybe we don't even use the word hunger, or that we don't operate with a lot of visibility there for that reason. I would say that's the exception, though. I think the better answer to your question is that in almost all countries, we work remarkably closely with the national government. We look at them truly as partners. We call them partners not because it's a humanitarian speak word, but because that's really how we see that relationship. We have to work with them to be effective in getting access to certain areas and understanding some of the local politics and local customs, and most country governments, because they've invited us in, want us there and want to see us do well. So no, I would say and also one thing that might interest you on that note is with activities like the school meals that I mentioned, we really see ourselves there only as a temporary Band-Aid. Our goal is to help build the capacity of the country government to turn then over the school feeding program to them to manage, which of course they would prefer. So we work very closely in activities like that with the host government to ensure they're empowered and we step out.
What percentage of your donations go to administrative costs?
I think it's about, geez, I'm sorry, I should have that on top of my head. I think it's about 7%. I mean, it's really an admirable rate within the humanitarian community for what that should be. And if I'm wrong later and I check and it's not 7, Sunita, I'll send it to you and maybe you can correct me in what you send out. But it's obviously we try to keep that as low as possible so that most of what we receive goes to the people we're charged with serving.
Thank you so much, Steve. And the World Food Program last year won the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize for its work to eradicate hunger. And we are very delighted to have you all here to speak at this very important briefing. We move on next to Elio.
Well, thank you, Sunita, for the presentation. I have to start by saying to my colleagues that the face of hunger in Central America has changed. And I'll get to that in a minute. And the reason for that is that since 2014, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua have been experiencing prolonged periods of droughts and excessive rains that actually destroy the crops and the livelihoods of farmer families. And this is a region where poverty, inequality, and climate shocks are at the root causes of food insecurity. Remember at the beginning, Steve mentioned the 3 C's. I think that in Central America, we're down to 2 C's. That's climate and COVID in this case. Fortunately, we had conflict in the past. Of course, we have some gang violence due to drug trafficking in the region. But for the most part, the most drivers of food insecurity in the region are basically climate change and COVID for the moment. Well, I'll have to say that even in 2015 and 2019, the region experienced, Central America experienced El Nino phenomenon. And we also found out in an analysis that we carried out that we found that 2015, in fact, was the driest year on record since 1981. So the situation was improving. You know, we had few rains at the end of 2019, but then in March 2020, we had the pandemic. Of course, you know, rural pandemics have been greatly impacted, but also urban communities. That's why at the beginning I said that the face of hunger had changed, because in the past, we were only focusing on the dry corridor where rural farmers live, but now because of the pandemic, hunger has expanded not just to rural areas, but also to urban areas. So the pandemic is affecting people all over the place, not just in certain areas. It's just not anymore a dry corridor thing. So let me hang on just a minute. So I have to say that why it's been so hard for the communities in urban and rural areas, because 50% of the labor in Latin America and in Central America as well, it's informal labor. I mean, informal economy, people who work on the streets, people who work, you know, for a few hours in a day and they get paid. And that even goes up to 70% in some countries. So what happened with the COVID restrictions, with the lockdowns, people could no longer go out to do their jobs, their day-to-day jobs. So they were having a really hard time. They couldn't meet their basic needs. They couldn't bring any money to their families. So what happened is that people were forced to reduce the amount of and the quality of the food they were eating. But then, as you probably saw in the news, then the 2020 hurricane season came. It was horrible. It was the most active in history, 30 named storms. Then in late May, we have Tropical Storm Amanda hitting El Salvador, which was very strange because this storm actually formed in the Pacific. Normally you have hurricanes and tropical storms coming from the Atlantic basin. Now this one came from the Pacific, which gives you an idea of how crazy the weather is right now. So people in El Salvador say that this was the worst storm they have experienced since 1999 when Hurricane Mitch hit El Salvador. Well, then you have Hurricanes Eta and Iota affecting Central America. At least 6.8 million people were affected directly by the hurricane. That number could go up in the next few months to 7.3 million people, because people lost their livelihood, they lose their assets. The fishery sector, they lost their boats, their fishing nets. In inland, farmers actually lost, whatever tools they use for agriculture. So I have to say that all these issues of food insecurity, climate change and the COVID came at a really bad time. We were really praying at, when COVID hit, that we were really hoping that the hurricane season will be a quiet one, as we had a few years ago, but that was not the case. So you have the sum of, recurring droughts and erratic weather, heavy rainfalls since 2014. Then you have El Nino, plus you have the COVID-19 pandemic, and now you have the hurricanes. So really the situation is very, very bad. So stories across Central America are the same. We just recently posted on our website, wp.org, the story of Marlene in Honduras, which I think exemplifies what people in Central America are going through. She basically worked selling food on the streets. She even had a peeling machine to peel oranges on the streets. Her husband worked as a bricklayer in the construction business. But due to the pandemic, due to the lockdowns, now he barely works 3 days a day, and he makes $10 a day per day. The family, because of the situation now, are selling, collecting bottles and collecting scrap and selling all of that for 8 cents a pound. And they have 4 children on top of that. So imagine how hard it is for them, lockdowns, COVID, the hurricanes, although they were not affected directly by the hurricanes, the husband used to work in a nearby house after he lost his job. But unfortunately, that house was washed away by Hurricane Iota, I believe. So he was left without a job. That situation forced them to join the migrant caravan in mid-January, if you may recall that event. But they crossed into Guatemala, but then in Guatemala they were stopped and they were returned, unfortunately. But for her fortune, we began distributions of food rations in her community, and Marlene and her family are actually WFP beneficiaries. So it's good that we managed to get to them. And I have to say that the situation is so bad that hunger back in 2018 to now in 2021 jumped from 2.2 million in 2018 to nearly 8 million today. So that gives you an idea of the situation. Now, what are we doing? What are we doing to help people in Central America to cope with the situation? As Steve mentioned at the beginning, and Annabelle also mentioned, we want to work with the communities and help them become resilient to climate change. Right now, besides COVID, the biggest challenge and the biggest threat they have to their livelihoods, it's climate change. And we are helping these communities to become resilient. How? We are actually helping to learn new techniques. For instance, in the case of Central America, families are used historically to plant their crops are beans and maize. But in the case of this region, these are very fragile crops. They need a lot of water. So if you plant crops like this, if you get a delay on the rains or get excessive rains, the crop is completely lost, okay? So we're helping them to find new livelihoods. For instance, we're helping some families to go into beekeeping, because in the case of beekeeping, if you produce honeybee, you can store it for longer periods. If you go into planting your maize and beans and you lose it, you have the alternative of selling the honeybee in the local markets. Another alternative that we have, that we're actually providing them with cash transfers. So we actually give them money so they have the opportunity to go to local shops and buy whatever food they need. Obviously, nutritious food. We're also helping families, to learn about nutrition. This is something that we found that it was needed in Central America. People just knew how to eat, but they didn't know what type of food they need. So they're finding new ways of finding new foods to feed their children and actually get a better nutritious food for their lives. So more or less, this is what I have right now. I have to say something that we're planning, we back in 2020, we reached 1.6 million people in Central America, only in Central America, and I'm talking about Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. But for 2021, due to the COVID crisis, due to the hurricanes, due to all these years of prolonged droughts and erratic weather, we are up to 2.6 million people in 2021. And I'll leave it to that, and I'll take any questions you have.
Elio, Henrietta Burrows has a very interesting question for you. Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Sunita. Elio, I find it fascinating that you mention beekeeping for people. In the US, bees are under siege, they're under threat, and they're disappearing for all kinds of reasons. So what's the situation with bees in Central America? Aren't they facing the same type of issues? I thought this was a global issue.
Well, thanks for your question. Being myself a I used to be a beekeeper, by the way. I'm very attached to beekeeping. So in the case of Central America, quite frankly, I haven't heard anything that they were having issues with beekeeping. It's a very expensive business. I have to say, it requires a lot of help. Sorry about my dog. For me. Apologies for that. But quite frankly, I don't have information, Henrietta, about have any issues with beekeeping in Central America. But that's one of the livelihoods we were actually helping farmers, smallholder farmers in Central America to learn, new abilities, new techniques, so they can become food secure.
I think we end the conversation here. It was amazing to hear from each of you. Sandy, some closing remarks?
So because we're so appreciative of having this expertise from our UN speakers, I want to just say what has so impressed me is that I make a mistake when I wait for the word famine. People are dying now. This is the time to send this is the time we need to be paying attention to spreading hunger, and we don't need to wait for the formal trigger of famine. So this is incredibly valuable insight. Thank you very, very much. And fantastic that you're all working on the front lines of this issue. Thank you.